Hello guys, and let's begin this video with a very short quiz, but promise me no googling, no telephones. How many cities of the Russian Federation can you name? Moscow, St. Petersburg, and silence. For many people around the world, Russia equates to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And no, it's not the fault of your educational system. That is the approach of the Kremlin. Only Moscow and St. Petersburg matter. And with each day of Putin's failed blitzkrieg, with more resources needed on the war machine and more people conscripted from the periphery of the Russian Federation, more and more voices in different regions and in different republics of the Russian Federation become more audible. And I think it's time to discuss that this large size of the Russian Federation does not mean the whole country is real. All people think the same, and most importantly, all people are the same. One of the greatest frauds of the 21st century is that the Kremlin keeps naming itself the Russian Federation when it acts as a super hyper centralized empire. Can you imagine meeting a person from Russia that does not speak Russian? There are many in Dagestan, in Buryatia, in Sakha. Can you imagine meeting Muslims, Buryats, who are a very big part of the population of the Russian Federation? No, because for many of you, the classical representative of Russia is a person living in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but that is very wrong. And today, unfortunately, living closer to Russia, I know more about these problems between the capital, Moscow, or the second capital, St. Petersburg, and the rest of the Russian Federation. And I think it's super important to discuss it in our conversation. So subscribe to know more about this part of the world. And it's super important to understand when making your decisions or building your predictions about the Russian war in Ukraine and the future of the continent and the world in general. And please share these videos, it helps a lot. But also, I love it that we have a real friendly conversation on the channel in our community. And I want to quote one comment that I recently read about a friend of the channel watching us from the United States and previously working in the far east of Russia in 2017. So even already after the start of war against Ukraine. And speaking for the people of the far east, they were very different from the Russians he expected to meet. They looked different, they acted different. That's because they are not Russians. And let's talk more about that, but from the perspective of the problems that the periphery inside the Russian Federation experiences when serving to the Kremlin's interests. But I want to correct myself saying periphery. It's not the periphery. It's regions, republics now under the suppression of the Kremlin. When we use the word federation, we understand that all these republics, all these regions are supposed to have a lot of autonomy and independence. But in reality, Russia, the Russian Federation, is extremely centralized. Everything is controlled by the Kremlin and everything belongs to the Kremlin. If we look at a way smaller part of the Russian Federation that the real Russia is, it's located in the European part of the continent, and it is not rich in the natural resources. And here we return back to the very important aspects. All the Russian money come from its natural resources. This is a resources-built economy. They sell oil, they sell gas, they sell various minerals, diamonds, and that's the only way they earn money. You don't fight for Russian cars, Russian mobile phones, I don't know, Russian software in your shopping malls. Russia only sells the resources. And here we come to the very important conclusion in this video. Russia sells the resources of other republics because this classical Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, does not have anything. The richest republics are located in the far east of the Russian Federation, in Siberia, in Northern Caucasus. This is Sakha, for example. This is Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and you often come across the names of these cities in my videos. Well, I know, now you know way more Russian cities because of the war inside the Russian Federation, invited by Putin, invited by the population that wanted the special military operation and invited it back to Russia. So we have a lot of republics involved in the special military operation designed in the Kremlin. Who pays for this so-called special military operation? These republics like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. If you follow me on the main channel or older channel, Anna from Ukraine, you know that in Altai, in Sakha, in Bashkortostan, there are a lot of protests against recruitment, against resources taken out, against the centralization. So people are dissatisfied with the two things that are very important here. Number one, being very centralized, control is over everything. So all the natural resources that these territories possess, they are extracted, they are sold by the Kremlin, and most of the revenue, most of the profit goes to the federal budget. And then these republics like Bashkortostan, Tatarstan have to beg Putin to get something in their local budgets. Well, not very good, right? But what is interesting, the Kremlin does not return a lot. That's why the far you are from Moscow or St. Petersburg, the poorer you are. Once again, those of you who traveled to Russia rarely visit Siberia, rarely visit Sakha. Most people stay in Moscow, St. Petersburg, maybe something like Sochi, a resort that is already a no-fly zone and Putin had to escape from it. But please take into account that these richest in natural resources, in oil, in gas republics, give everything to Moscow. Moscow sells it and then does not want to return the revenue to these republics. If they were a real federation, they would get everything. But no, that's not the reality. That's why the so-called periphery of the Russian Federation lives a very bad life. All over the internet, you can come across a lot of photos from, I don't know, Omsk, for example, where Russians mock their own life, saying that no one bombed this village, but it looks worse than some of the Ukrainian cities after the Russian bombardments. And that's true. In many of these regions, they don't have hot running water, they don't have toilets in homes, they don't have asphalt on the roads. They don't have helicopters to carry people to hospitals in the distant parts. Because you can guess where the majority of the Russian helicopters are. Yes, being destroyed on the front lines in Ukraine and now Russia. So these regions that have everything to be rich now serve the purposes of the Kremlin. So not only they steal their money, they make these territories poor, but then they conscript people from these regions to the front lines because what? Because they are very poor, because they don't have any serious companies to work, they cannot build businesses, everything is very depressive. They don't have infrastructure. If you don't have, I don't know, a normal road in your village, it's very difficult to become a good farmer because how will you deliver everything? Or if you don't have electricity, or if you don't have toilet, it's difficult to build a good service system or something like that. That is the reality. So they are robbed by the Kremlin, and then they are robbed of people by the Kremlin. Because if you look at these typical Russian soldiers in the Russian army, once again, they don't look like Moscovites. They come from very different nationalities and they are poor. They know very little, not just because they did not work hard, but also because Moscow did everything to keep them, if it's possible to say so, in such regime. And if you compare a salary of a person in Moscow with a salary of a person in Tuva Republic, it will be 3, 4, 5, 10 times bigger. So perhaps one and only way for such a person to earn something is to join the Russian army. Now they stopped paying what they promised in the Russian army in many republics. Why? Because they don't have money for that. But they will have problems with the Kremlin again. Why? Because the Kremlin needs people in the meat grinders. They are losing a lot of people for literally no Ukrainian territory. That's the classical Russian approach, scorched earth policy and meat grinders. It's now something innovative. So they will now punish these republics for not providing enough people to the meat grinders. Punish with what? With no money to their local budgets. So can you imagine the depths of the tragedy of these people? From this faraway perspective, you don't know anything about them. You're not to blame. Once again, Kremlin, Soviet Union did everything for you not to know these people. And honestly, I remember how at the beginning of my YouTube life, many asked me to explain more about Ukraine because once again, I remember this quote, you've told me that for many, Ukraine was just a rebellious part of Russia. And I don't blame you because of the Iron Curtain, because of the strategy built by the Kremlin and maybe lack of efforts from Ukraine after we regained our independence. But something very similar is now happening to their republics, to various nations. Being that large, being the largest country in the world, you have to understand that Russia is not, Russia is not monolithic. They don't have a unified identity. And it's not okay that speaking about the largest country in the world, the majority people on the planet know only Moscow and St. Petersburg, forgetting about dozens, hundreds of cities and regions that actually feed that Kremlin. Right now, this money are spent on the destruction in Ukraine, on hybrid attacks on your countries. But they could have saved those poor people in those republics not having normal roads or helicopters to deliver, I don't know, women to the hospitals. Once again, Moscow and St. Petersburg not having any resources, which are the basis of the Russian budget, live their best life, super rich, and many people are struck with the wealth of it. And then countries that actually possess this wealth, diamonds, oil, gas, give everything to Kremlin, have nothing, and to survive need to join the Russian army. Of course, this does not give them an excuse because, well, come on, try and change something. Work for freedom, independence, protect your families. They don't think that way. Maybe they are too traumatized. I don't know what's the reason. But it's obvious that conscription is not happening in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It happens in Buryatia. It happens in Dagestan. It happens in Bashkortostan. And these are distant regions that do not have direct connection to the Kremlin. They don't have any political influence. They are constantly guilty of everything, not giving enough people, not giving enough resources, not protecting everything. Once again, when you think about these oil refineries, many of them and gas pipelines are actually located not around Moscow. Because Moscow is poor. Moscow simply steals all of that from other regions and then steals people. And they cannot resist because they literally have nothing. They don't have roads. They don't have normal internet. And together with that, they don't have dignity. That is closely connected. Putin is very much afraid of having a middle class, people who start traveling, who start comparing, who start asking questions. His plan is not just to destroy Ukraine, but also to destroy such, how to say, describe ethnically diverse republics. And that is another war crime. That is another sin. And those of you who care about humankind, who want to be, so like perfect and don't blame, like try to be neutral, please think, if you don't care about Ukrainians, if you don't like us, think about those people inside the Russian Federation that are also sacrificed. So the only way to save them too is to defeat the Kremlin. And here in Ukraine, we are working on that. And I do realize that now, after 3.5 years of Putin's failed blitzkrieg, after more than 10 years of war in general, you do know more about Russian cities. But because of our geography lessons, when you discover new locations based on the destructions of military sites there by Ukrainian drones, by Ukrainian long-range missiles. But please, when listening to that, understand that Russia is not all Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this largest country in the world has a great potential of the dissolution to become, smaller, more natural, more corresponding to the idea of the Ruski Mir. Because people in Sakha have very different language, have very different history. People in Dagestan are Muslim, and some families have, like, for example, one husband, lots of wives, and they do not identify themselves as Russian. Nenets people in the Far East, they live by, hunting and by having deers, and they have their own religions, and they are closer to the American native people. Then there are lots and lots of people that have very different faces, very different religions, very different languages. And they have great chances to be rich, to try to be democratic. But the Kremlin does not let them, stealing the money. Good news here is that they are becoming more and more dissatisfied, and this may lead to problems with this desire to be less centralized, to give less money that will anyway be burned by the Kremlin, and to try and protect them. In the comments below, let me know what are the things you would like to more and understand more about this part of the world. Do you know any cities inside the Russian Federation, and do you feel that it's not all Moscow and St. Petersburg? Maybe share some of your personal experiences, because this indeed inspires lots of our conversations. I value our community on this channel very much, and thank you so much for being my friends and my family. Remember to follow me on Anna from Ukraine too, and also on social media. Check our merch shop, all the links that you need in the description of this video. Thank you for buying me coffees, becoming my patrons and sponsors of the channel, but most importantly, thank you for standing with Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!